Jason. What's the 2-minute version of you? Like, who are you? How'd you get here?
Again, I'm Jason Cardoso. I'm an instructional designer. I work with advanced learning technologies. I also work with Cheryl Young in lifelong learning. I just joined Miami about a year ago, so actually just before LTSI. My background, I started out in higher education, doing work for University of Iowa.
Can you get the microphone with right head?
To be honest, and I'm front row.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There's a mic right
Is there a
there.
microphone?
It's right up there on the left.
Insert joke about technology and technology guys not working. Da 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 da. You can all think of one.
Insert joke.
What's that?
The horse walks into the bar. The bartender says, "Why the long face?"
That's good. I got nothing.
Okay, can you hear me now? No. Can you hear me now?
You gotta like be like Justin Bieber and just wear it right in your face.
All right, I'll just try to speak up. Can everybody hear me a little bit better now? Not really. Okay. All part of working with technology. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah.
It's actually working now. So apparently I have to hold this in front of my face. So again, my name is Jason Cardoso. I'm an instructional designer. I just joined Miami a little over a year ago. Started out in higher education, doing some advanced e-learning back early 2000. Spent better part of the last decade or so working in corporate space, working in industry with a variety of different companies developing e-learning. Also working with the Air Force to develop some advanced multimedia e-learning. Just joined Miami again back in April. So with that, I'll turn it over to Artie.
This is hilarious. Okay. Hi, so like Jason said, my name's Artie Kuhn. I am the assistant director of AIMS, and I teach interactive media studies stuff. So interaction design, data visualization, that sort of thing is kind of my world. I'm like Jason, I'm not from around here. Before I came to Miami, which was about 2 years ago, I worked in industry as an interaction designer, both starting off kind of in traditional interaction design space inside of a design studio and then an ad agency, and then I left that world to work leading software development teams, building kind of innovative products inside of the educational space. And this is kind of where I came from the last 5 years or so before I came here to Miami. Has anybody heard of any of these things? Okay, good. That makes me feel a little good. That warms my heart a little bit. The one I really care about is Applia. Any of you know of Applia? Okay, good or yeah, mostly good. Okay, good. So that's good to hear. So what my group was tasked with was we were embedded inside of a traditional publisher. So we were, Thomson Publishing became Cengage Publishing, and so I was at Thomson Publishing, and my group was to build software to basically try to dismantle the old company. So as you can imagine, we weren't very popular internally, but we were very popular among students and faculty. So Applia was a startup that Cengage acquired that was in San Francisco, and we built educational homework packages. So like really high-end, not multiple guest homework, but like really smart homework around. So if you're teaching like an economics class, you can drag and drop graphs. If you're teaching a logic class, you could actually have students like do logical proofs and things like that, and the system would all auto-grade it and blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of where I came from. And part of the ethos of that San Francisco world is a handful of concepts that they all kind of orbit around this idea of iteration and failing, and that's actually a good thing, that failure is a good thing, and this ethos of failing forward. And when Jason and I were talking about what we think is a good way of kind of segueing into from Glenn's stuff about the sky is falling to what we wanted to show, which is kind of like tactical, boots on the ground, how do you actually make this stuff go. A good segue would be to kind of look at how the startup culture out in San Francisco has evolved and how it's kind of blossomed and how that could be applied to how we all do what we do. And so I wanted to show you a couple examples from failure that I think are really great. So you may or may not know, before the iPhone came out, which by the way, here's some crazy stats about the iPhone. Last year, Apple's revenue from the iPhone, just the amount of money that they took in at the end of everything, so after taxes and all that kind of stuff, after you pay for all your equipment, just the amount of money that they earned just on the iPhone itself, not the iPad, not the Macs in front of you with the giant screens, not the software, just the phone alone, not even iTunes, just the phone alone. They actually made more money than all of Microsoft in 1 year, all right, which is mind-boggling. Okay, that is crazy. A hardware company is not supposed to make money. They're supposed to be these low margins, blah, 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 blah. They're not, it's crazy. And this product didn't even exist in the marketplace 6 years ago. In fact, when it came out, guys like the head of Microsoft literally laughed at it because it didn't have a physical keyboard and a removable battery. And remember this? This was a thing that people were worried about, right? Didn't have flash, right? And now it makes more money than all of Microsoft, which is crazy. So how did Apple come up with it? Well, originally they weren't planning on making the phone. They were going to make the iPad. And they started about 10 years ago. And because of the lawsuit with Samsung, infringing on their designs and their patents and stuff like that, Apple had to release a lot of their iterative stuff, which they never do. They're kind of a black box about that kind of stuff. How do they come up with this stuff? So they had to release some of this. And these are actually actual products that they come up with in developing the iPad. And I think it just shows some great failure. So they had like, hey, what's it look like if we have a little kickstand on the back? You can see that originally they were calling it iPod. What if we had like this little curvy handles on the side so you couldn't drop it? Then they realized, hey, we should probably make a phone instead of an iPad, instead of a touchscreen big device. Let's make it a phone. And so this is some of their first iterations around the phone. You can see there's some visual language that moved on into the existing phone, but you can see there's also a lot of stuff that's totally bunk and just didn't make it. It was a failure. What if we make it a little bit from Battlestar Galactica and have these like angled? Yeah, okay, 3 people in that joke. That's cool. And then eventually they end up with a phone that launched. The iPhone 1, which itself had a bunch of components that failed. It didn't succeed in the marketplace. So, for instance, if you remember back, the first phone didn't have the App Store. There were no apps on it. All right, it was just the ones that shipped on the phone, which is kind of crazy when you think about the success of the App Store today. Or the first one didn't have a normal microphone jack. It had like this funky microphone jack that you couldn't use normal headphones in, right? A whole bunch of stuff that the first one was kind of a failure. And then they iterated and iterated and iterated and iterated to the point where now it makes more money for them than all of Microsoft, right? Which is crazy with a K. Like it shouldn't be that way. And so how did they do that? Well, I don't think there was one point in time where Steve Jobs sat down with his people and said, okay, 10 years from now, this thing that we think might be like a tablet-y type computer, we're really going to make it a phone, and that phone is going to have these apps with an app store on it, and we'll make the first one with no app store, and then we'll add an app store, and then we'll have this thing where you can talk at it, and it'll tell you to do things, and blah, 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 blah. Like, there was no meeting where that ever occurred, right? There was no, let's sit down and plan this out, this strategy for 10 years. What's our big strategy? Instead, it's clear from this, as well as just other stuff around this, that strategy was emergent. Well, there was ambiguity. There was no way to have a strategy, because strategy reinforces processes and things like that, right? And if you don't have processes, if those things don't exist, you can't have a strategy. Does that make sense? What's that?
No.
Okay. Well, you can't have in 10 years we're going to do this strategy. You can have an emergent strategy that emerges over time as you watch your users use something and see how things respond in the marketplace. And so, we'll talk. Let me give you another example. So, when I was at Cengage, one of the kind of the leading thinkers that really influenced how I would develop products and things like that with this guy named Clayton Christensen. Has anybody heard of this guy, Clayton Christensen? He's at Harvard, right? And he's developed this theory of innovation and disruption and blah, 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 blah. Really, really accessible, but for dummies like me, but really smart, good stuff. And he has some great things to say about education, and he has even better things to say about other stuff about building products and things like that. And one of the stories he talks about emergent strategy is the story of the Honda Super Cub. And so way back, Honda was looking at, before they had started making motorcycles for sale in the U.S., they looked at the U.S. market and they saw that in the U.S. market there was the success of the big Harley-Davidson motorcycle, right? This big, burly thing, right? And so Honda wanted to get in on that. They looked at it and said, hey, we have the tools, we have the resources, we have the processes in place to make motorcycles. We can do that. And so let's go ahead and make ourselves one of these big kind of head-on competitors for the Harley-Davidson. And so they spun up factories to build these things, and they started a beachhead in the United States selling these big motorcycles and selling them like Harley-Davidson did in these big dedicated stores and things like that, and they had these big old motorcycles. Well, they realized a problem relatively soon, and that was that they didn't have the expertise that Harley did, and so their motorcycles broke a lot. Unfortunately, stateside, they didn't have any repair shops. There was no expertise in fixing Honda motorcycles because that all lived over on the other side of the ocean. And so what they'd have to do is they'd literally take these motorcycles and put them and ship them on freight across an ocean to get repaired, and then ship them back once said repairs were done, and you have your new motorcycle. Pretty awful experience, right, for your consumers. Pretty awful. And so they obviously, as you would expect, didn't have very much success at first. However, so what they started doing was doing cost-cutting measures. How can we reduce costs? Well, we don't want to ship and a whole bunch of other things. We don't want to do these courier things. So what they had over in Honda was another product with these like little mini motorcycles. And what they were sold was for courier services to kind of zip around the busy streets and things like that. And so they shipped a handful of these over to the retail outlets on this side of the pond in order to reduce costs so that they could have their employees courier things between various locations and stuff like that. Well, on the weekend, one of these employees that had these little mini Cubs, these things that were designed to be used in busy streets, took one of these out into the hills around San Francisco, or I think it was around LA, and got some buddies and had fun just driving this thing around in the mud and going over hills and stuff like that on the hills. And people saw that and were like, oh, that looks like fun. Where can I get one of those? And said, well, we're not really selling these things, but I guess you could come. We got a couple, and we'll probably sell them you can come down, we'll sell you one, that kind of thing. So, and thus the Honda Super Cub, the dirt bike, and all that kind of stuff emerged out of nowhere. It emerged out of nowhere. There was no strategy. There was no big meeting where it was said, we're going to sell these things. It was, we're going to sell these things. That completely failed. We're going to try these other things. We have these other things to do to save on courier costs. We'll ship those over there. And that emerged as the thing that led to Honda's success in the motorcycle business. And it's not just a different kind of product that innovated. It reached a different consumer. The people that drive a Harley-Davidson, none of them are leaving their Harley-Davidsons to go get Honda Super Cubs, right? It also resulted in a change in how the thing is distributed. So they didn't sell the Super Cubs through dedicated Super Cub stores at first. Instead, they actually found that Sears and places like that were interested in putting them in their catalogs. And so they actually sold these things through a completely different distribution channel than the normal way of doing things was. Does that make sense? Emergent strategy. All right, so how do we actually put a framework around this? This idea, it seems so random. The Honda Super Cub thing is completely random. How do we, as educators, how do we look at this new technology and these new opportunities and develop a strategy around that? And Jason and I are going to talk about the university's strategy that we've been serving on this committee to kind of help form and stuff like that. And we have a couple of examples of this. But the reality is that there is no big boardroom strategy around this kind of stuff. And I would argue, nor should there be. Instead, what we should be doing is experimenting like crazy, failing like crazy, and hope and pray that we find some little grip that is the right thing to do, kind of like Honda did. And when we find it, then run like crazy with that thing. All right? So we already know a lot of what succeeds and fails in the educational space and the educational technology space. We know a lot about that kind of stuff. We can inform those. That can inform our kind of direction that we want to head in from an emergency strategy standpoint. But we should be evaluating kind of cyclically, looking back. What have we done so far? What's working? What's not working? That kind of thing to allow our strategy to emerge as we go through these woods. It's kind of like the metaphor that I like is it's kind of like this big field, and the paths emerge as the deer run across it enough times, right? We can go and pave a road through this field tomorrow, and that might work, all right? We might hit the right place to put that path. But a better way is instead, like on our campus, is to look around, where are the students walking across the grass? And when that gets beat down enough times, just go ahead and put concrete there, right? Instead of trying to map it out ahead of time, right? And so what's a framework? Because we don't want just chaos. We don't want everybody doing whatever they want. What's a framework that we can use that helps us inform this strategy? And so Christensen, who I mentioned before, has this theory of innovation and disruption that I think is really helpful. He talks about there's 3 different kinds of disruptions. And disruptions are when you have what he calls an incumbent, an existing major player, radically gets displaced from the place of being the major player really, really quickly. Is what he calls a disruption. So an example of a disruption, for instance, back to the iPhone thing, an example of a disruption would be the BlackBerry. Right? RIM and BlackBerry, super dominant 5 years ago. Today, barely making it by, right? Barely have anything left. And how are they disrupted and that sort of thing is explained inside of Christensen's theories. So he talks about 3 different kinds of disruption. One he talks about is a low-end disruption. And in a low-end disruption, what happens is the existing incumbents get really, really good and optimize around the most demanding consumer. All right, so BlackBerry is a great example of this. Everything that BlackBerry was doing was around business guys sending texts to one another and sending email to one another. Right? They optimized around that. They were the best at that. Right? And then what happens is that eventually leads to over-serving the customers. All right, the customers, it's too good. They don't need all those buttons. They don't need all those bells and whistles. It's not worth that extra money or hassle or inconvenience for them to have all that stuff. Does that make sense? And so then a product comes along that's a low-end disruption. A product that comes along that's lower than that super high level. It's either cheaper or more convenient or both, and completely displaces the other one because it rapidly gets better over time. Does that make sense? At low-end disruption, the initial product offering might be really crappy. And the people at the top look at it and laugh it off and say, well, that's just blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that they don't realize that thing's going to get better over time, sometimes really, really fast. Such to the point where even your super high-end consumer doesn't see value in your product and instead sees this other thing as better. So one of the patterns that we see happening all the time for these incumbents, and I would say that universities are an incumbent at this point, is this from McLuhan, who says that you're all literate, so I don't like to read from slides, but I'll read it to you anyway. The student of media soon expects that new media of any period, whatever, be classified as pseudo by those who acquire the patterns early in media, whatever they happen to be. So for instance, whenever there's a new thing that comes out, everybody frames that new thing in the context of the old thing. Okay? So, hey, movies. Well, they're kind of like plays that are recorded, right? Hey, television. Well, it's kind of like radio with screens. Okay? That sort of thing. You with me? All right? Hey, e-learning. It's kind of like lectures, but on a screen. Okay? That kind of approach is kind of how everything starts out. And again, it gets laughed off by the people that are the dominant players. So, radios. RCA and a whole bunch of the other incumbents of this era had these really expensive high-end radios that required lots of maintenance and specialized training and maintaining them. The transistor is developed, and at first the transistor yields these. This is Sony's first or one of Sony's first radios. And at first, it's really crappy. It sounds awful. The speakers aren't very good. It picks up really limited stations and all that kind of business. All right, and so at the time, the incumbents when this came out, the incumbents looked at this and said, it doesn't sound as good as our radios. Okay, it's not going to sell. It doesn't sell through the same channels as our radios. This is just a fad. This is nothing to worry about. Look the other way. This thing is awesome. This thing that we have. Okay, the problem is that they didn't realize that there was an entire segment of the consumer base that this was exactly what they wanted. Teenagers. It was a pocket-sized radio that could go anywhere. And sure, it sounded like garbage, but who cares? I wanted to stick it in my pocket and move on. And rapidly, that technology got better and better and better and better and better and displaced the incumbents entirely. And so, really, what Christensen would argue, and I'd argue too, is that there's three kinds of questions people often ask when new technology is coming out. The first question is, well, what's everybody else doing? What's been done with this? Right? The second question is, what do people say they want? Let's get some surveys together. Let's do some focus groups. Let's figure out what the people say they want. And the last question is, what's the job to be done that this product can be used on? And Christensen and I would argue as well, says that the first two questions for developing new things is kind of irrelevant. For marketing those things might be super relevant. But for developing the new things, not relevant at all. Because the first question, what's been done? Well, that looks at, hey, what's happened before, not what does the inherent qualities of this new thing have to bring to the table. Okay, so it ignores the new stuff. The what do people say they want question, doing surveys and focus groups and all that kind of stuff. People don't know what they want. I've done a lot of usability research and stuff like that around digital products and stuff like that. And I'll say, hey, what do you do with your computer? Well, walk me through your day, blah, 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 blah. And they describe this intricate system that they've come up with, and it all makes a lot of sense. And then I sit behind them and I watch them do what they say. I watch them do their jobs, and it's radically different than what they say they do. All right? People like to paint a picture that's much cleaner than the reality is. Okay? And when you actually watch the real thing, you see all these pain points that exist. Then you can make things that eliminate those pain points, and people get delighted and all that kind of stuff. Or the other problem with focus groups, like Steve Jobs famously would say that Apple would never do focus groups, and they don't. Because he would say that, well, they're just going to tell me what they've seen before, right? They're not going to tell me what's some new thing, all right? Instead, Christensen would argue the question that we should be asking is, what's the job to be done? And so this gets back to Glenn's point about what's the role of the institution for us? What's the role of a university? And when you think about what we do a lot more than simply brain dump information into people's gray matter, right? We have, for undergraduates, the job to be done at the university is teach them how to be a grown-up. Like, that's a big piece of it, right? How do I do laundry? How do I wash dishes? How do I, get by in life? How do I make friends with people that I didn't grow up with? Like, all these things that are part of, normal life, right, that the institution provides, and we kind of provide scaffolding around helping people figure that out. That's a really valuable thing, that we don't. That's a job that we don't actually normally think of the university as supplying. Does that make sense? So instead, we should be thinking about what's the job to be done and what do we want to do. And what's funny is that Sony, the company that came up with this, really rapidly got displaced by the company that came up with this, right? Because they became so wedded to their proprietary internal way of doing things that they became completely blinded by this. And so this is a cyclical thing. That this innovation and disruption and incumbents that get disrupted, this is a cyclical, happens over and over and over again. I really love the quote that Glenn put up yesterday about history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. And that's just, that's a big piece of that. So that's low-end disruption. How do things start at the low end and rapidly raise through to displace existing ones? Another one of these disruptions that Christensen talks about is new market disruption. So these are new things that no one has thought of before that comes in and disrupts an existing thing. One of my favorite examples of this is going way, 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 way back to the biggest invention in human history outside of the wheel, the printing press, okay, and Gutenberg. And what Gutenberg developed, we own the printing press, but there's some really funny things about this when this kind of new market emerged. This printing press, this new thing emerged. It was something that, it wasn't possible to have a book outside of a particular people set and things like that. As this thing emerged, and some really funny things happened. The first is, and I found out last year that we actually have a whole bunch of these, I think we have a whole bunch of these here at Miami, right? Yeah. Is, you may or may not know, but this is really interesting to me, is the incunabula, the swaddling clothes, all right, of the first generation of books are called the incunabula. And as a designer, books are a big deal to me, in print and type and all that kind of jazz. And so at the beginning, the incunabula are funny because they tried, this is an example of a printed book, they tried really, 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 really hard to mimic the patterns of the previous method of delivery. So, for instance, you can see here, this stuff is the only printed stuff. Everything else was hand painted onto this page. Okay, they tried really, really, really hard to look like it had been copied by hand, like the previous medium had been. Even down to typography choices. They tried really, really hard to make it look scripty. Just a few decades later, they started to embrace using woodcut to put those illustrations down, okay? Which makes things a lot cheaper and faster and all that sort of thing. But it's still basically the same kind of things, same kind of layout and stuff like that. A few decades later, they started using it for really precise lines, really high precision, a new way. This is a new thing that couldn't be easily replicated in the previous medium. It's new, right? And in fact, it then goes on, and then there's lots of crazy explorations of options. So this is a Euclidean geometry book from 1570 that actually has these like fold-out things glued into the pages, which is totally nutso, right? Like, why don't our textbooks have this kind of like tactile learning thing? I don't know, 4.5 centuries later, I couldn't tell you. But it folds out and that sort of thing. And then we have Galileo, and Galileo's book, Galileo starring Messenger. The ideas that are being communicated in this thing probably couldn't be communicated using the previous medium. So, how would you copy this by hand? That's really hard, right? That's really, really hard. That couldn't have been communicated using the previous medium, at least to an audience that was bigger than 2, right? And so we see that really rapidly, this is not in computer time, this is in real life time. Really rapidly, we moved from this thing that tried to look like the previous medium to this new thing that was both a new way of printing. The technology was completely different. All the images are printed, right? Instead of some of it being printed and some of it being hand-drawn or hand-replicated. The ideas inside of it, probably almost impossible to communicate using this old method and some other things. Does that make sense? This is a new thing for a new market. And then it disrupted this way of doing things that was over here. And what I think is fascinating about this stuff is that oftentimes new market disruptions, when you look at them, is they often incorporate technology that is not new. When we actually get to the technology, the portion of like tips and tools and tricks and that kind of stuff that Jason and I are going to show you, there's actually nothing that's like, oh, it's a 3D hologram thing. Like there's no like big new component to a lot of this stuff. And it's usually, and this is not just for us, but this is true, it makes me feel a little bit better, is that it's common, is that when there's new stuff, it's actually just a combination of really old stuff in a different way. So for instance, and going back to the printing press, this is very, very similar to Gutenberg's printing press. Does anybody know what this is actually used for? It's for, what'd you say? It's a wine press. It's a thing that squishes grapes, all right? His printing press used the same technology as the wine press that had been developed about 3,000 years earlier by the Romans. Almost the exact same technology used there is used here, it's just in a different context. Does that make sense? Or 2,000 years ago, sorry. So what Jason's going to do is, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. So that's the big disruption education piece, all right? And I would argue that the sky is not necessarily falling. It's scary, all right, but it's not necessarily falling. Instead, there's a lot of opportunities out there. If we look at this stuff and we rethink what the purpose of what we're trying to do is, what's the job to be done at the institution, that we'll actually discover new ways of moving forward that aren't totally terrifying. And so Jason's going to talk about MOOCs, which are the buzzword du jour, and show us some examples from that world. Cool? Make sense?
Okay, can you hear me now? I apologize, I'm a little volume challenged this morning. So on the topic of disruptive technologies, I think we've got an excellent example. New York Times described 2012 as the year of the MOOC. And as we come into LTSI, I think it's important to take a chance to reflect back on just how recent this phenomenon really is. Just as recently as April of last year, Coursera was courting the first 5 universities. Around this time last year, edX was in the process of forming with Harvard and MIT. And just by the summer, we're seeing the reports of MOOCs hosting as many as 150,000 students. So this phenomenon is very new. And right alongside the New York Times, we're seeing articles in the Chronicle talking about things like the disruptive qualities of the MOOCs. How it's going to impact the for-profits, take down branches, impact higher education. So who are the MOOCs? When we're talking about the MOOCs, we're primarily talking about 3 companies. We're talking about Coursera, Udacity, and edX. Coursera and Udacity started by Stanford faculty, primarily funded by venture capitalists. They were really the first on the scene, and quickly following them, we had Harvard and MIT forming edX, primarily through endowments, helping to build an open learning platform.
I'm sorry, what did you say? What was the timeline between the first leader and then the follower?
Coursera and edX really emerged early 2012. edX really got up to speed closer to May of 2012. Okay, so what's a MOOC? We all know what a MOOC stands for, massive open online course. And we've seen various permutations of MOOCs already, MOOCs, MOOCs, MOOCs and OCs, all variations of removing the massive, removing the open. What do you have left? You have an online course. But we do have 2 different types of MOOCs, the XMOOC and the CMOOC. The XMOOCs have really gotten a lot of the press. CMOOCs have been around since about 2008. Their focus is really more on creating learning communities. But the XMOOCs are really focused on leveraging video technologies, auto-grading, exams and quizzes. They're created chiefly by faculty who are computer scientists. So they're creating a platform to help facilitate learning.
Excuse me. So why X and C? Cross-platform and construction is?
Yeah, the C is for connectivist. The X, I think, is conveniently related to edX and just sort of that, add an X to a thing and it makes it new.
It's for extreme.
For extreme, exactly, extreme e-learning. But MOOCs are also, we can think of MOOCs in some different ways also. The provost talked about MOOC as a publishing platform, and we see examples of that with the Antioch licensing of Coursera. Coursera is actually using Antioch is actually using the Coursera platform to offer their courses and facilitate those courses. MOOC as an LMS system. edX combined with Stanford. Stanford recently joined edX. They're combining their Class-to-Go platform into the edX open source learning platform. So we're seeing this emerging e-learning management system. MOOC as content provider. Vanderbilt began to offer a Coursera course wrapped with their facilitation. So they're taking an actual MOOC, they're using it in their course, their CS390, which they offered last fall. and they're using their instructor to facilitate that course, adding material, adding assignments. So using that like a flipped classroom or an inverted classroom. And MOOCs can also be thought of as a marketing tool. There are a lot of MOOC courses that are also related to certificate programs, online degree programs that are offered by major institutions. University of Illinois Sustainability. Intro course, free. It's offered on the MOOC. It's offered on Coursera. But they're also offering through their university, not through Coursera, their online certificate programs, their online graduate programs. So there's a lot of different ways MOOCs can be used and are being used. So why make a MOOC? I think the appeal for a lot of faculty is just being able to connect with broad and diverse range of students. MOOCs allow you to impact students throughout the world. It's a tool for democratizing education. It's making Western education available in places where it really hasn't been before. So it's creating that accessibility. And it's absolutely an experiment in mass education. There's a lot of data coming in. We don't really know where it's all going. But it's pointing to some interesting possibilities. So MOOC criticism, a big focus, and it really centers on the XMOOCs, is the focus on the transmission method of instruction. So focusing primarily on content, focusing on auto-grading at the expense of student interaction. And then we've already talked about the low completion rates. The average is close to 7%. This website has some excellent information. But where is that 7% coming from? When you're offering something for free, you're getting a lot of people joining MOOCs for very different reasons. So a lot of people are there to sample it. A lot of people are there just because they're curious. But of that core 7%, they're actually going through, they're doing all the work, and they're actually completing these courses.
Could you explain that a little bit more in terms of the segments that are actually utilizing MOOCs the most? So you're saying that there's samplers. What part of the pie are samplers?
Yeah, I think we need to go back and look at some of the statistics that are coming out of sites like the Katie Jordan, but MOOCs really are appealing to a really diverse population. So the people who are signing up for these courses, they could be high school students, they could be senior citizens, they could be people who just have a peripheral interest in the content, or they could be experts in their field. So it's a very dynamic and highly diverse learning community.
Is there no mechanism for student interaction for these then?
There are, and we'll get to that in a little bit, because I'm going to do a little bit of a survey of some of the MOOCs. So again, some of the benefits means for educators to have a large impact on a diverse population of students, supporting lifelong learning. I think this is one of the areas where MOOCs are having some of the biggest impact, and to the degree that they're displacing courses, this is one of the areas they're displacing. Generating awareness of potential for online learning. That's been one of the biggest impacts is MOOCs have really helped to further this conversation about what is online learning and what can we do with it. Pushing new technology platforms and possibly new publishing models. We talked about Coursera, the relationship with Antioch, licensing agreements, things like that. MOOCs are starting to be thought of as a different publishing model. And in terms of new technology, we'll look a little bit at the platforms for Coursera, the platforms for edX. They're really test beds for how we present online learning.
So how do you think Miami would react if we assigned our students a MOOC and that was 12 weeks long?
Well, there's actually one of the faculty in psychology. I gave you the example of Vanderbilt, the machine learning course. And that faculty member is actively exploring doing that with that particular course. So at this point, Miami doesn't have a policy saying, no, you can't do that. But there are some intellectual property issues that we do have to work through. In that example, Coursera had to give their permission, and we also had to get permission from the faculty member. The way Coursera is organized, as I understand it, every institution kind of has their own agreement in place. So just because it's offered in Coursera doesn't necessarily mean that institution is going to be willing to allow you to wrap that content in that way. So there's certainly possibilities out there, but we really need to explore them on a case-by-case basis.
But edX has the
ability to be open source, so you can, edX has put a lot of the stuff on open source, and you can take that course and wrap it up. But they have not made all the videos available for everything.
Yeah, and the different MOOCs have different policies. Open as in open to students, open as in open and free, doesn't necessarily mean open in terms of open source and in a Creative Commons capacity. So different groups have different policies.
When you say that Vanderbilt licensed it, you mean that they're paying to use that content?
Antioch licensed it. Vanderbilt is actually now one of the institutions associated with Coursera, so they may have had agreements in place at that time when they began to offer that course, that wrapped course. But that is something that being part of those MOOCs could potentially lead to some possibilities.
So if Miami decided to license it, why would they need to surround tenured faculty?
I think that's an interesting question, but I think it reflects back on some of the things that Glenn was talking about yesterday around the flipped classroom and the notion of being able to use this expert content from diverse sources and being able to supplement, with the faculty as facilitators. So it's not about replacing faculty. It's about changing some of those roles and changing some of those dynamics and allowing you to add additional content to your courses.
The equivalent question might be, why don't we all write our own textbooks? I think we use other people's textbooks because it allows us to do what we want to do in the classroom better. I don't doubt that there is the risk and the possibility, and I think the legitimate concern about whether or not
Students pay for the textbooks.
right.
If the institution were paid to access the MOOC, that would flip with the cost, though.
True. I guess that's true. But the line gets really blurry there where the institution may pay for a movie that you show in the class that the students aren't paying for. The institution pays for some content that we share. So that's a good point.
Okay, thanks. So what can we learn from the experts? Above all, it's a great opportunity to take an online class. If you haven't, I know the statistics said something around 30% of you had taken an online class. How many of you took a course from one of the MOOC providers? Coursera, edX, okay, just a few of you. So it's a great opportunity. They're free. There's a lot of interesting content out there. It gives you an opportunity to explore, look for best practices, get some ideas for your own courses, and also identify maybe some not so best practices.
So what are those?
The best practices, we're going to get into that in just a minute.
Okay.
If we ever want to do this, would you be able to navigate like how to find one so that I don't become one of the 93 person who started and don't finish it? I don't want to accidentally find myself in physics. So will you go over like?
Yeah, we'll talk about what's available, how to get there.
Not that
There's nothing wrong with being part of that 93%. I am part of that 93%. I sample a lot of the MOOCs just to get ideas, just to see what they're doing.
Jason, Raj has
I actually take it because I'm not able to keep up with all the technology, so to keep up with the material. I go in and look at just the pieces that I'm interested in, and then I don't do the homework, I don't do the rest of the stuff. I pick it up much quicker, less quicker. It's as easy as reading a book where somebody has focused it and structured it well.
Exactly, yeah. So we'll just do a couple of quick chores here. So this is Coursera. We saw this splash page yesterday with Glenn. Get an idea of some of the course offerings here. We'll go down into some of the course lists. Lots of different categories from the arts, humanities, law, mathematics, business. This is just a sampling. Introduction to Operations Management, University of Pennsylvania, Emory University, University of Virginia, Sports and Society. So it's really kind of a diverse array of courses. Once you've registered for Coursera, you've selected your course, you'll log into the course screen. It looks like any other LMS. So we get access to announcements, quizzes, video lectures, discussion forums, a lot of the components that we'll see and we'll talk about with Nika. So again, what Coursera is, it's a learning platform. It's a platform for hosting this content, but it also happens to have the attribute of being highly scalable. NICA probably cannot support 150,000 students in a course. There's some technical constraints around that. But that's what Coursera was designed to do. So again, this is a splash page for the course. Video, again, a big part of course delivery for both Coursera, edX, Udacity. Here's a couple samples. So this is a course on gamification. Lots of video lecture that includes screencasting, electronic whiteboarding, so you can kind of see some examples. Gives you some ideas for what you can do with your own course. These are all things that we can do here in Miami. Technology available, you've got the resources around you right now. And the questions come up around assessment. So quizzes. These are electronically graded, and right now, for many of them, you're not necessarily, there are ways to get credit, but they're intended to be non-credit. But they are giving you some ways to assess yourself, to assess your performance. In addition to the quizzes, there are also written assignments. Who here wants to grade 100,000 students? Nobody. Right. So they use a peer grading process, and this is highly controversial, but it's an interesting experiment in this sort of mass education. So students do write the assignments. They get a detailed rubric. Students are held accountable for trying to adhere to the rubric, and it involves a lot of self-evaluation. So it's a lot of self-reflection, peer evaluation, but it still allows them to do some more creative things and work in areas like the humanities. edX, similar concept, different platform. Again, you can go to the main page, sign up, self-free, go in, take a course. MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, again recently Stanford joined edX, so a lot of great institutions offering some interesting things. In terms of the design of the interface, edX is being a little bit more creative. They're trying to really kind of push the envelope a little bit in terms of design. It's very experimental. Again, the platform is open source, and we'll hope to have an opportunity to look at it in more detail in the future. But here's an example. Incorporates video, incorporates some additional text. Similar to Coursera, supporting things like discussions, ways to have sort of peer-reviewed graded written assignments, and things like that. One I haven't mentioned yet is the Canvas network. Canvas is a little bit new as a MOOC. Canvas itself is a learning management system provider, more comparable to Blackboard or Sakai. But what they've done is evolve their platform to be able to support the scalability that we need to be able to offer massively online course. A lot of the Canvas courses tend not to be as massive. They limit enrollments. So massive may mean 5, 10, 15,000 students rather than 100, 150,000 students. But just to give you an idea, we'll take a look inside. So Canvas system is a little bit more representative of the types of features that we have available to us in NICA. So if you're looking for a site with lots of free courses to get lots of ideas on how to build your own, Canvas is an excellent place to start, particularly the Canvas network. So you can see that all the content is organized in modules, so everything's very granular. Also incorporating a variety of different types of media elements. Here's an example, which actually is a video of a Prezi, or as a Prezi, which incorporates a video with the visual note taking. So 3 layers of presentation. So again, the MOOC links, this slide deck is going to be available, so all the links. There's also one that I didn't talk about, which gets into some of the characteristics in more detail of the connectivist MOOCs. This will be made available to you on Coursera, Udacity, edX, and also Canvas.net. Again, excellent places to start to get ideas on best practices. also some not so best practices. You'll see some things that don't really seem to make a lot of sense, and it'll help you be able to better identify what's going to work for your courses. So on that note, we'll start to talk a little bit about distance learning, effectiveness, online quality standards. So categories of distance learning. In 2001, Taylor described about five different generations of distance learning: correspondence model, multimedia model, telelearning model. Things have been around for decades, if not half a century. Print, computer-based learning, interactive video, and certainly teleconferencing and televideo. So it goes on to describe three generations of e-learning. The first generation of e-learning just involved online material with simple graphics, access to internet resources, low-fidelity streaming, and that new technology called email. Okay. When I got started, particularly around corporate training in the late 90s, this was state-of-the-art. This was the state-of-the-art in terms of tutorials. This is the state-of-the-art in terms of what you saw in a lot of university courses that were being offered on platforms like Blackboard, platforms like WebCT. The next generation of distance learning, or the second generation of e-learning, this is where you're getting into more interactive multimedia. You're getting into richer streaming video, access to more diverse internet resources, the use of virtual learning environments, things like Sakai, learning management systems, and online assessment. And this is really, in many ways, where Coursera is right now, and edX is right now. Although underlying those are a lot of analytics, which can be real powerful in the future. But in terms of the content delivery, not very dissimilar. In sixth generation, here we're getting into more complex modes of instruction. Being able to leverage e-portfolios, blogs, more highly interactive technology, simulations, games, online visualizations, being able to build robust online communities, as well as mobile learning, or M-learning. Okay. So Glenn touched on this a little bit yesterday. I just want to touch on it for just a minute. The idea of distance learning effectiveness. There's been research that has gone back over 60 years. Certainly talking about print, talking about televideo, or video instruction, as well as online instruction. That has found that there's no significant difference. No significant difference in terms of student outcomes and effectiveness. Okay. And this site, nosignificantdifference.org, is a great reference. So they've compiled all of this research. You can go search their database and see lots of examples. So here's just one excerpt from a study of an intro biology online course. No significant difference observed between the two groups. So in terms of effectiveness, the research is out there. But again, we know of face-to-face courses that are less effective than others. There's going to be that variability. There are better ways to do things, and we're going to explore those in terms of the best practices. So quality standards. So these next two slides have a lot of information. They're mostly links. They're there for information purposes, but it's to kind of set the context that there is more than one. A lot of institutions have developed their own. And in fact, University of Florida really took and aggregated the quality standards across institutions, across publications, to try to come up with their own. Miami University is part of the Quality Matters Ohio Consortium. ELAC, the E-Learning Advisory Council, is recommending that we start with Quality Matters as that baseline. And Quality Matters is a very good baseline to start with, and also serves as a baseline for many of these other individual institution-developed standards. So again, just for information purposes, this is all going to be in the slide deck. I'm not going to go into any of these. But this information is out there. So if you want to look for additional quality standards, if you want to be able to compare and contrast, this information is available. I'm also co-facilitating an FLC this fall for the College of Arts and Sciences, where we're going to look at all these, and we're going to help to try to draft a set of quality standards that are appropriate for the College of Arts and Sciences. So we're going to aggregate this information similar to the way University of Florida did to try to build upon the base of Quality Matters to come up with a set of clear standards that work across that division. So again, what is Quality Matters? So Quality Matters produces what they call the Quality Rubric. It's a set of standards and guidelines for developing, presenting online instruction. They also provide faculty training on the rubric as well as for being a peer reviewer. This is training that we're looking to offer in the fall, so we'll have a trainer from Quality Matters come here to Miami and hope to get that scheduled soon. They offer a certification process. This is something that's some institutions have taken advantage of, but a lot of the larger institutions have tended to use Quality Matters kind of as a baseline and innovate on top of it. So just at a high level, the Quality Matters rubric covers things like overview and introduction, learning objectives, assessment and measurement, instructional materials. It's really looking at the structure of the course. It's looking at basic instructional design principles. And I'll just pull up a little more detailed example here. Okay. So if we're looking at the Quality Matters rubric, we'll just pick out the example here of overview and instructions. So these are the types of things that we're talking about. Students are introduced to the purpose and the structure of the course. The self-introduction of the instructor, to build instructor presence in the course. Learning objectives. Learning objectives describes outcomes that are measurable. Basic instructional design principles. Learner interaction and engagement. Learning activities that provide opportunities for interaction and support active learning. Course technologies. Again, course tools and media that support active engagement. And the important things are things around things like learner support, things that we don't necessarily think about in an online course. When students come into the classroom, they know where the doors are, they know how to navigate it, right? Online courses, not so much. Online courses, even though we're using the same platform, we're all using Nika, a lot of the courses look very different. Students get very confused because everything is in a different location. Everything is organized in a different way. And accessibility. So I'm not going to go into this in more detail, but what I have for everyone, we have a copy of the Quality Matters workbook. I have enough of these for everyone. This goes into this rubric in a lot more detail, so it can serve as an excellent reference for you to get started. So again, QM alignment, when we're talking about alignment, we're talking about basic instructional design principles, aligning your objectives with your measurements, aligning your content with your objectives and your measurements, helping to support learner engagement, and using technology that supports that, all with the goal of supporting those student outcomes. So the QM rubric can be used as a guide. It can also be used as a means for evaluating your course, to sort of use it as a checklist, to identify, have I gotten some of these important elements. Research to support. Quality Matters is actively looking at research and online learning, using it to help fine-tune the rubric. I won't go into this at this point, but these links are available that go into detail on a lot of the literature that's supporting this. So what QM is and what it isn't. So again, it's a starting point for identifying the features for an effective online course. It's not an explanation for how to teach online. The focus is really on web usability. how to navigate the course, how to create a course that is usable for the students, easy for them to understand. It's not a rigid course design plan, and it's not a template. The focus is on basic instructional design principles. It's not dictating any specific instructional methodology. So it's really just kind of creating the framework for how that course can be supported online. It's creating sort of the architecture for you to fill with your method of instruction. So some additional best practices. Again, using design concepts, using design concepts driven by objectives. A big one is the course organization and design, making the course easy for students to navigate. Active learning techniques. A lot of these are just good teaching practices. Giving students opportunities for watching online tasks. Maintaining regular contact. In an online environment, this is really important. In a lot of online environments, there's virtually no real contact between the instructor and the student. But being able to create opportunities for that is really important. Having online office hours. Being able to have more robust exchanges, either through email or through how you're providing feedback on assignments. Okay? The idea here is that the students feel supported and feel some connection both to their instructor as well as, ideally, some of their peers. They're not just working in isolation. And encouraging contact, encouraging cooperation with students, so having some level of student engagement built into the design of the course. Providing prompt feedback. Students have varying expectations in an online course. Most students think of an online course, any online course, as naturally asynchronous, which means that they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. So to the degree that a course is time-bound and activities are time-bound, they need to have clear understanding and expectations around them. Certainly there are always concerns around ethical behavior.
Are you going to talk to how you post something like this? I mean, you're going to have to spend 48 hours a day on this?
Yeah, we're going to get into that more in the second half. So we'll talk about some of the course architectures. We'll talk about what it's like to kind of experience teaching in an online course. These are all things that Artie and I are going to cover. So I just kind of dropped this in at the last minute, and this is really sort of a reflection on a comment that Glenn made yesterday, talking about the spectrum in terms of online learning. And I really just want to reinforce the point here that e-learning is a spectrum. Okay? Blended, hybrid, and online are all different forms of this technology-mediated instruction. So everything you're doing for your blended course is going to naturally spill over to your online course. If you're already flipping your classroom, you're already creating these assets that can be reused. If you're preparing a course to be taught fully online, everything that you're doing with that fully online course can be incorporated back into your face-to-face course. You're just changing some of those dynamics, maybe changing the way you're doing some of those activities. So it really is a continuum.
What's the difference between blended and hybrid?
Yeah, it's a fuzzy definition, but the way I tend to think of it is blended is really anything that involves technology. So hybrid tends to be this discrete, I'm going to be online for a certain portion of time, and then I'm going to be face-to-face, maybe for a proctored exam, or I'm going to have a group face-to-face meeting. So there are a few days, or maybe half the class that is scheduled face-to-face. So that might be something that's a hybrid. But something that is more on the spectrum of face-to-face, that is involving technology, that's a blended course. So if you're doing the flipped classroom, you already have a blended course.
I have a question.
Sure.
Given that you just went over best practices, it looks like you were quoting research, but I would suspect that for the amount of time that we've been offering hybrids, inverted, blended online, that we should have some observations that we've noted. As a matter of fact, I sat in on an FLC that was offered online. You could log into it online through, I think it was through Illuminate. And they said, absolutely, positively have your face somewhere accessible so that they see you, they know you, they have this connectivity. They also said, absolutely don't take something that McGraw-Hill has packaged that says this is Marketing 291, read everything McGraw-Hill created, that disengages the student. And so to that end, do we have some what classes they're dropping, who's staying, who's not.
Yeah, in terms of designing the best practices for Miami, again, this is an active process. And as already talked about, this is going to be an iterative process. Certainly there's been a lot of great work done over the last decade or so. And I know there are many faculty in Miami who have been teaching online in one capacity or another for a very long time. And we want to try to leverage that information and pull that information in. So we're looking at finding tools to be able to disseminate those best practices, further that conversation, leverage what's already been done, but also look at what we can do next and be afraid to take a few chances. So we're going to get into some specific examples in the next hour or so, but absolutely.
I just know from academic advising, when my incoming freshmen have accidentally registered for the online English class, they come running back and say, I don't want this. So I mean, that's just an anecdotal example of data points that we could be utilizing.
What we're seeing, and Jason, you can tell me where I'm wrong with this, but sorry, is that when you look at which students succeed in online courses versus on-ground courses, is that there are a handful of key factors that help those students succeed. And off the top of my head, I don't have my notes in front of me, off the top of my head, I believe that those include things like ability to time manage really well on their own. Because in a traditional classroom, they know that for X number of hours, they're going to be in Y location every single week. Whereas online, they can fit it in wherever they want. And so some students really, really struggle with that. There's also, some students think that when we start talking online, which I think is probably true for some faculty when we start talking about teaching online, is that it means lower quality or lower standards or something like that. And they feel like some students are here because they want a high quality education. You know, some are here just so they can check a box. But some are here because they really want that high quality thing, and so they run away from the online thing because they're afraid that it's going to be lower quality. And I think that both of those things we get around with time. You know, by proving over time that part of the cultural dynamic when students talk about classes, they talk about this great online class that they had, addresses the second problem, the quality problem. And the time management problem, I think, is just something that we address by recognizing that some students, when they're 19 years old or 18 years old and they start here, aren't at a place to be able to manage their own time. And so we're not talking about replacing anything. We're talking about augmenting or supplementing our existing ways of doing things. And so that stuff will still be there. Would you agree with that, Jason?
Yeah, and Arnie makes a good point, and this is an important point to consider. From a time management standpoint, students in an online environment don't have the same kind of structure that they have in a traditional face-to-face environment. So you have to find ways to create that. So creating time-bound activities, creating opportunities for communication really helps drive that engagement.
I think what she's asking, do we have, as Miami, do we have any data? Have we collected any data?
No, we haven't. I don't think that there's been enough. There has not been a centralized effort to do that. I think we all have anecdotal evidence, and I'll talk about my own experiences, but there's no centralized data.
My sense, thinking about summer school here, summer school enrollment is way down because students are deciding they don't want to stay in Oxford for the summer, and as a result, they are often taking online courses at other institutions. And that has been primarily driven by dollars. So my question is, in terms of the future one is imagining, why would parents want to keep paying Miami tuition if what is being delivered to them is online learning, that its primary attraction, at least in today's world, is that it's much cheaper?
Okay. So let me address that from how Ames is addressing this stuff. And I'm going to skip to what I was going to talk about, so you'll see me flip through some slides frantically later. But we don't think in Ames that, at least today, in 5-10 years this might be different, but at least in this moment of time, that online is replacing on-ground for a significant chunk of our curriculum. So what we did is we actually looked at all of our course offerings that in order to get a degree in interactive media studies you have to fulfill, and we color-coded them. This would work online out of the box. It would be easy to move online. This would be a real struggle, but would be doable. This probably ain't going to happen anytime soon, right? Given the technology that exists. And we also looked at what's the job to be done of the undergraduate education. And we kind of thought about, well, all that stuff that I mentioned before. We teach kids how to be grown-ups, right? And so if you're in your mom's basement taking my class and not here in Oxford, Ohio, A, I think it's really hard for me to get through all the curriculum that I want to cover for you to graduate in that mode. And B, I think you're missing a lot of what the undergraduate education brings of making a grown-up. However, we're looking at the job to be done at the graduate level. So personally, I think the biggest disruptive threat for technology is not at the undergraduate level yet. It may be eventually, but not yet. It's at the graduate level. And for a lot of folks that, at least for the people that are interested in interactive media studies, our potential graduate students, are folks that graduated in design or writing or et cetera, those kinds of things, before technology became a significant factor in those kinds of things. So these people are 35 and above. And so they need to get supplemental education to be able to move on in their careers. They're not looking to go, if they get an MS to move on to a PhD or something like that and go teach in academia. They're looking for something that will serve them to move forward in their careers. And for those folks, the job to be done with education is completely different than the job to be done with education for undergraduate, right? You with me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you guys with me? Right? So what that means is that making those people take 2 years off of earning an income and moving to Oxford, Ohio to take classes is lunacy, right? We're going to get a very small number of people that are willing to make that investment. Instead, if you're 35 or above, you might have a family, you might have kids, you're embedded in a location. Instead, for those folks, fully online makes a lot of sense. And so what we've done is we've looked at our curriculum for our graduate certificate program and identified a track through it that is possible to do fully online. Does that make sense? And so from that perspective, it's augmenting and supplementing and sustaining what we already have here, not replacing and wiping the slate clean. Does that make sense?
Do you see the same change from freshmen to seniors?
Of undergraduate? For our undergraduate stuff, we're experimenting. You're looking for data. The problem is to look for solid data is that we're in that incunabula stage still, right? We're still figuring out what this thing's supposed to be. Like, those early books didn't even have page numbers yet, right? Table of contents were like 20 years after Gutenberg, right? No one's figured that stuff out yet, and I think we're still in that stage where there's a lot of fuzziness, right? But I will say that for us, we're experimenting with, instead of thinking like, okay, normally a freshman takes this, normally a sophomore takes this, normally a junior takes this, maybe that's the right track based on time management skills that develop over time. But we're starting more at like the curriculum level. Which one of these classes would be easy? We're just looking, honestly, we don't want to fight a battle we don't need to fight. And so instead what we want to do is like, which courses make most sense to deploy online? And that's where we're starting. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if that's the right strategy, but it's the one that we've...
I got a question.
Did I answer your question? Or
Yes,
is it...
yeah.
Okay.
I have another question that's been rolling around my head, and that's, when do we get to the point where we have to prove that our income from these online courses is going to equal or better the on-ground courses, so that we can continue as an institution? When does that start? I don't think we can answer that, or I don't know, Bonnie didn't ask that yesterday, but he's charged with making sure we're whole fiscally, right?
Yeah. Who's put together the business plan in ELAC? I can't remember who's...
I never sure the people involved. Council is all involved.
Yeah. So that's not a blind spot. That's actively being figured out. For us, our online classes are the same tuition as an online class. You register for our class if you're an undergraduate student or a graduate student, just like you register for something that's going to be in this room, you register it online. And we think of it as, and this again might not be the thing that's going to last, but for today, we think of online as just another space. So just like I might have a studio space and a lecture hall and a discussion space and a lab space around campus, then online is just another room. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm confusing MOOCs as an offering along with our online classes.
Yeah, I don't think that the Venn diagram of those two things is not 100% overlap. Does that make sense?
Is it
Yeah.
like 10%?
I'm sorry?
Is it like 10% or is it like?
I think that depends on our discipline. You know, like some of our disciplines don't need a lot of instructor. You know, the scalability of an instructor is impossible at 10,000 students, right? You can't, that's impossible. You can't touch all those students. But some courses and some of our disciplines can scale in that way, and some more than others, right? So like, I don't know. I don't want to get too specific in my world because everybody thinks that they're a unique snowflake. But I don't think everybody is a unique snowflake. I do think the reality is that some of our disciplines scale in different ways and adapt in different ways.
Yeah, and no one is even suggesting at this point that online courses at Miami need to scale to be MOOCs. In fact, that one of the core insights from the ELAC subcommittees, when we looked at online courses at a lot of these major institutions, anybody want to guess what the average class size is? 25. 25 is considered optimal. Optimum to have that active learner engagement. Okay? So yeah, a lot of things kind of go out the window when you scale to 10,000 plus. But for what we're still looking at doing the same brand of instruction that Miami has been doing for centuries. And just being able to leverage the technology to help support it. In terms of the strategy, this is something we'll talk a little bit more briefly about towards the end when we talk about ELAC and some of the recommendations. But having a strategic plan is part of that outcome. This isn't something that is in place currently. These are recommendations that are being put forward. But the institution is looking at what makes the most sense. Students taking summer courses elsewhere. This is one of the things that's at the top of the list, and it's driving a lot of the courses that are currently in progress right now. Is which are the courses that are being taken at other institutions online already by Miami students, and being able to offer those here at Miami, bring that revenue back to Miami. So it's not replacing anything at Miami. We're just bringing the students back.
But isn't another solution to say 75% of your degree is organic? Miami, or, yeah. I mean, that's just a little thing in the bulletin.
Sure.
That's also
Other things
the
happen.
cart putting the cart before the horse, right? We don't exist. I mean, we need to make money to keep on doing what we do, right? But we all took this job. We all could make a lot more money someplace else, right? We all took this job because we care about teaching and students and stuff like that. And so if we make our decisions starting from there, if that's one of our core principles, then.
Well, I think that's why this discussion always gets so at hand. I mean, there's the idea of using technology to improve the education of our students here on this residence campus. That's a no-brainer. Everybody's behind that idea. But there's also, sort of bubbling around here the idea that we're going to reach other students, that we're going to make more money doing it, and that and that part of it is very, very fuzzy. It doesn't make much sense to me in my head. We've got a lot of bricks and buildings here that are very, very expensive. It makes our online courses more expensive than the University of Phoenix or some other institution. So if we're trying to do MOOCs, I don't think that we're going to be, that people can either buy our MOOCs or somebody else's MOOCs. Our MOOCs aren't going to be as cheap as other people, just because of the way our institution works. So that part of the conversation seems to me to be a little bit of a distraction, but also a real important long-term problem.
Where do these two integrate? I don't think it's been figured out yet.
Yeah,
right.
exactly right.
But I would also throw into the mix that for us, for Ames, we're looking at online classes, not from the, hey, how do we supplement students that are residential, or just how do we bring in new students through our graduate program. Also, like we have a class that's being taught, that just wrapped up, that's being taught by somebody that's sitting in San Francisco. So we're finding ways of having online classes where it allows us to bring experts from other places in the world to our students that are residents here in Oxford.
That's a real value. I see that. That's very, very
Yeah, so that kind of experimentation. I don't know if that's going to be what we do long term, but it's just an experiment in that kind of thing. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
That's okay.
I just want to just jump in for a second, just to somewhat take devil's advocate position here, because I actually agree with what you're saying, teacher. I think we
Can you
really.
speak louder, please?
I'm going to take a little bit of a devil's advocate position here, because I do think there's a bit of sort of, we just need to flap harder in that kind of argument here. Well, we built all these buildings, and I can sort of imagine people at Kodak, 10 years ago saying, well, we've got all these production facilities that make cameras, and, this isn't the time for us to get into digital production. I think there's a reality that we're going to need to deal with around the way that people are going to be learning in the next 50 years. And it's not that the institution itself needs to totally do that kind of thing, but likewise saying just because we have the buildings and just because we have a residential university, that should be the only thing we do, I think that's not a strong enough argument against it. I think the better one, which is really the one that I've heard you say and Artie say here, is we need to be really strategic about what parts of what we do can we do well in that space, can we compete, right? And which are the ones that we can't compete at all, we shouldn't be messing with it. It shouldn't be this kind of blanket mandate for us, but there needs to be this strategic conversation at the meta level for the whole university, but then also within each of our individual units where we ask these questions about the courses in our degrees or our degree programs and where we can take advantage of them. There you
Thanks, Glenn.
go.
Yeah, it's getting to be about 10:30 right now. This is around the time we're going to be taking a break. So just to kind of wrap things up, I guess some of the key points here, embrace innovation. Explore the free courses that are online through Coursera, edX, to help generate some ideas. Look at the quality standards. This can serve sort of as a baseline blueprint to help guide you as you develop your courses and start thinking about courses, whether it's blended, hybrid, online. And think about things strategically from the standpoint of how you're developing your courses. Start with the flipped classroom, the inverted classroom, building those media resources. And then build up from that and think about things like learning communities. So we don't all have to jump to third generation e-learning overnight. We can start small, build up gradually, start with blended courses and go from there. And again, to kind of reinforce Artie's point, try it, test it, iterate. Okay, we want to be able to try different things, collect student feedback, see what works, what doesn't. Technology is always going to be changing. So there's always going to be something new on the horizon that we're going to want to test out. So with that, I think Peter's giving me the nod. It's a good time to take a break.